Hello. Probably if you're watching the replay, you're catching this part of the broadcast, but I always give a few seconds for the people catching it live and to make sure that the broadcast actually connects with Facebook and YouTube. So give me 1 second while I ascertain that. Here we go. Looks to be on Facebook. Baruch Hashem. Who is with us? Where are you tuning in from? A good vach shavua tov. Okay. There we go. Beautiful. Who's going to comment first? Let us see. Christine Moreno says hello. Hello, Christine. Sharon Fran Brooks, burning the midnight oil, says Shavua Tov from Lebanon, New Jersey. Bill Eldridge from the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley. Sue Strauss from Chicago. Bill says, and happy midsummer. Midsummer, right? Tomorrow's the first day of summer. Shabbat here in LA ended at 8:52 p.m. this week. Next week, it ends at 8:53 p.m., and that is the apex of the lateness of Shabbat ending. The following week after that, it will end at 8:52 p.m., and then it'll get earlier and earlier. So we're pretty much there. Next week is the very latest that Shabbat begins and ends. Christo Cheney says Shavua Tov from Lubbock, Texas. Alejandro Martinez says Shavua Tov. Jill Croyson from California. Derek Annunciation has joined. Frona Adelson says Shalom. Kelsa Canedo says it's almost midnight here in Pasadena, Texas. Sherry Schwartz has joined. Luis Figueroa, hello from Greece. Yasu. Great to see you all, my holy sisters and brothers. Came out of Shabbos today. Glad to see that, at least from a cursory glance of the news, nothing major that we have to worry about. So let's get right into our learning. We are holding on Daf Kuf Vav. That's page 106 of Tractate Shabbos, the second volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 13, and it's a very short chapter. So even though we're only discussing the second Mishnah of chapter 13, we're going to wrap up that discussion of Mishnah number 2 and begin and end Mishnahs numbers 3, 4, and 5 and wrap up our discussion of chapter 13 tonight. God's help, tomorrow we'll continue on Father's Day with our discussion of page 107. Normally I go about 6 p.m. Pacific, Sunday through Thursday. Tomorrow being Father's Day, I've got some plans with the family. I'm going to broadcast, but I plan to broadcast with God's help. Religious Jews will never say, I'm going to do something in the future. We say, I plan to, or with God's help, it will happen. God willing, or in Hebrew, im yirtzeh Hashem, if God helps. But at any rate, or if God wills, rather. So I'm planning that I'll probably go tomorrow at about 2 p.m. Pacific, sometime about 2 p.m., 2:30 p.m. Pacific, something like that, rather than the normal 6 o'clock slot for Sundays. All right, let's get into it. We are discussing some mourning practices, mourning the dead, that arose from our discussion of the prohibition on Shabbos of weaving. How do we get from weaving to mourning the dead? Because we learned that weaving and is also has similar minimum measure to become liable for the Torah prohibition as sewing, 2 threads for weaving, 2 stitches for sewing, and one is also liable if he tears a garment such that it's going to require 2 stitches to fix it. You won't be liable if you simply tear your garment just to destroy it, because we're not liable for destructive labors, purely destructive labors. But, for example, a tailor who tears clothing in order to get at another part of the clothing, he tears open a seam so he can adjust a pocket or something, and then he sews it back up. So even though he's tearing open a seam, he's only doing that as part of his constructive labor. If he tears a seam such that it will take 2 stitches to fix it, so then he would be liable if he did that on Shabbos. And this brought up the question about one who tears his garment. It's a Jewish tradition that when somebody very close to us or someone we care about, somebody we're emotional about, when they die, we could tear a garment. One is obligated to tear his garment for an immediate relative. Some opinions hold that for your Torah teacher, somebody who you personally learned from, you should tear your garment. Or when you're present when a Jew dies. That all seem to agree that if you're present when a Jew dies, you see somebody die, you must tear your garment. But if you hear that somebody dies who was a very upright person, even if he wasn't a Torah scholar, but somebody who was saintly, such a righteous person, somebody who did great, great good in the world, who was not suspected of making any, not somebody who did crimes or violated mitzvahs, such a person, a saintly person, somebody who was just good all their lives and did so much good for others. If you hear that such a person died, you could tear your garment. If you're present when that person died, you must tear a garment, just like for any Jew. But it's going to be, a lot of people are going to tear their garment if they benefited from such a person, from the saintly works of such a person. Now that we're discussing these mourning practices, we actually discussed this yesterday, that one who cries over the death of an upright person, over the death of the righteous, his tears are stored in heaven on his account. And not only does heaven look incredibly favorably when we mourn the loss of a righteous person from this world, or when we mourn the loss of a great Torah scholar, but even some of our sins will be forgiven because we pay close attention and we grieve the loss of the person from this world. And vice versa, if a great person, a saintly person, a great Torah scholar dies and we don't really care, so then heaven will look at us and not care whether we live or die. So, if you find that you're not moved when a great person dies, somebody who's great because they were saintly, great because they did so much good for others, then you want to cultivate that emotion in yourself. And on today's daf, we continue, and we have this nice teaching. If a member of a group dies, everyone in that group should be concerned. Right now, we're not limiting it to a great Torah scholar or to a saintly person or where we're present at the death of another Jew. But if you're simply a member of a group and somebody in that group dies, you should be concerned. Now, it's not explained. Why should you be concerned? It is a halacha, right? Rambam says if a member of a group dies, the entire group should be concerned, and just leaves it at that. Now, one reason could be, well, there's something rotten in the group, and maybe punishment is coming to the whole group. Another reason could be, maybe this was the greatest person in that group, but some calamity is coming into the world, and for whatever reason, this group finds itself on the front line. Another reason could simply be that if a member of a group, whatever, and how the group is not defined. Does it mean that it's your alumni, your group of alumni that you all graduated from the same school? Does it mean that you're work colleagues? Does it mean that you're a set of siblings? Not defined. But what they're saying is, anytime a member of a group that you're in dies, get into it. In other words, get into the emotion of that. Allow it to penetrate you. Allow it to pierce you. Now, I think that's human nature. I think that when we, it's very different when we hear that some stranger died or that a celebrity died. It's quite different than when we hear somebody we knew, somebody that was a part of a group that we're in, dies. Our sage is telling us that's a natural feeling and it's an important feeling. And don't shrug it off. Spend some time with that feeling. Spend some time eulogizing this member of the group that was lost. And I was reminded of a very famous poem by the English poet John Donne called "For Whom the Bell Tolls." And John Donne wrote, it's a very short poem, "No man is an island entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own or of thine friends were. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. And I think the teaching here, and the reason that our sages left this definition, this line, if one member of a group dies, all should be concerned. And they didn't say, well, what kind of group and how big a group and how close the relationship should be. They left that to us to define. And I think the reason is because we need to have a more expansive understanding of the groups that we belong to. And as John Donne is saying, anytime you hear that someone has died, ask yourself, are we both members of some group? At the very least, you're both humans, right? So anytime you hear that another human has died, but take a moment, right? Take a moment. And that's why it's a Jewish tradition. Whenever we hear that someone has died, we say Baruch Dayan Emes, right? Blessed is the true judge. We immediately say, okay, God had a reason for taking this person. But the understanding of that... Candle. Oh, thank you. Nina reminded me I forgot to light up the darkness. There we go. I get so into the teaching that I forget our little traditions. Okay. But we want to have a more expansive understanding of our connections to other people. And when we say, Baruch Dayan Emet, God is the true judge, we're saying we are diminished that person was taken. God must have had a reason. God is the true judge. He has a reason for everything. God has a reason for everything that God does. But we have to allow ourselves to feel diminished whenever someone is lost, and especially if we have any kind of common ground with that person. Okay, from there we go on to renew again. And I mentioned this already at the top of our session today, of our AT Daily today, that anyone who performs labors destructively is exempt from bringing the sin offering for violating the biblical prohibition of working on Shabbos, right? So meaning all of the labors, as we know, the 39 labors that are prohibited on Shabbos are related to constructing the Mishkan, constructing the tabernacle in the wilderness. In other words, making something, producing something. So if you just destroy, it's going to be rabbinically prohibited, but you're not going to be liable to bring the sin offering. You will not have violated a biblical prohibition because all you did is destroy. Now, sometimes destruction and construction are actually very similar and very close together. Like somebody buys a house and tears it down. Why do they tear it down? Because they want to build a new house on that same property. What they really bought was the lot, and that's a great location. They want to build a new house there. So tearing down that house, it's totally destructive, but it was for a constructive purpose. So if there's any constructive purpose for the destruction, you will be liable. Apropos of this teaching, Rabbi Abahu taught a baraisa in the study hall before Rabbi Yochanan. And he said, all destructive labors on Shabbos are exempt with the exception of, except one who inflicts a wound or kindles a fire. Rabbi Yochanan said, go teach that outside. In other words, that teaching is unworthy of the study hall. All destructive labors are exempt. Now, what you tried to say is that these particular ones, inflicting a wound or kindling a fire, that they sound destructive, but in fact they have a constructive purpose. That one who inflicts a wound, and so then Rabbi Yochanan clarified, he said, if you want to say that, okay, and make that a legitimate teaching, then what you have to say is one who inflicts a wound in order to get the blood. That if for some reason blood is needed, for example, if you were going to do a blood transfusion, you were going to draw blood from somebody, so you would wound them, right? When you draw blood, you put a needle in their vein and blood comes out. It's a wound. But of course, you do that for the life-saving quality of the blood. So that's a constructive act, and of course, you wouldn't be exempt for creating that wound. One who kindles fire, it's like, well, wait a minute. The first thing we learned about Shabbos is that it is explicitly in the Torah, you cannot kindle a light. Kindling a light, I mean, like I just lit a candle. Of course, Shabbat ended, so I can do that. A good vach to you and a Shavua tov. But what they're saying is if you kindle a fire just to burn something down, if you want to make that a legitimate teaching, you'd be liable for creating a fire if for some reason you needed the ashes. So if you needed ashes and you burned something to get the ashes, obviously it's constructive. So what Rabbi Yochanan was saying to Rabbi Bahu is like, that doesn't need to be said here. We all get it. If it's destructive, it's destructive. If you're doing it for a reason, it's not destructive. It's paving the way to do the thing that you actually need. But why did Rabbi Abahu, who was a great sage in himself, why did he feel the need to say this in front of Rabbi Yochanan? Everybody knows this. Perhaps because in the case of inflicting a wound, he was thinking of a teaching of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said that one who inflicts a wound is liable. Why? He was thinking of the circumcision. It says in the Torah that you will perform a circumcision on the 8th day, even if it's Shabbos. Because it's written explicitly that you will perform the circumcision even on Shabbos, Rabbi Shimon learns out from that to do a circumcision, yes, it's permitted, but any other wound is not permitted. But the sages disagree with Rabbi Shimon. A wound, which is just a wound, it's not a constructive act, and you're not going to be liable for it unless you did it for a reason, like drawing blood. And Rav Ashi would answer Rabbi Shimon and say, actually, don't call the circumcision a wound. It's not a wound. A circumcision is a repair, right? That when the child comes out, when a boy comes out of its mother, when a baby boy is born, the Jewish understanding is it is incomplete. God partners with the Jewish people and says that for that boy, that for that person to be completed, to reach its sort of perfected state, God does all the work. Well, the parents come together, they start the process. God does all the work, created a human species that could reproduce, created the conditions, and then, does all the creativity that needs that baby to grow within its mother. And that baby boy is born. And for that baby girls are born perfect. Baby boys need one more step in order to be finished Jews. They need that circumcision. So finishing it is a repair, not a wound, according to Rav Ashi. Now, what's interesting is that nowhere in this discussion does it say that a circumcision doesn't count as a wound, not because it's a repair, and repairing objects on Shabbos is prohibited, but why not say it's a different labor? It's striking the final blow, right? And the reason that the Torah has to mention that it's permitted on Shabbos is because otherwise we might have thought that it is makeh b'patish, striking the final blow that perfects the boy. But that's not suggested. No one brings that up. I'm observing that nobody brings up that it's makeh b'patish, striking the final blow. And I learn from the fact that no sage discusses the circumcision as possibly constituting striking the final blow. I learn from that you're not striking the final blow when you're born and then they just add a circumcision 8 days later. The human is never finished. The human is never finished. There is no final blow. We must work on ourselves every day of our life. When we're growing up as children, obviously we're changing every day. There's constant change in the human as he or she grows up. But even once we're adults, and you might say, well, then we acquire our final form. No, we are meant to improve ourselves every day of our life. We're meant to learn. We're meant to do. We're meant to acquire better characteristics of kindness, of compassion, of generosity, of level-headedness, of wisdom and intelligence, of majesty, etc. The human is always being improved. There is no makeh b'patish. There is no striking the final blow for the human until the human is literally done and leaves this world. till the soul leaves this world. This brings us to the third Mishnah of chapter 13. Now we move on to a different labor. If you have questions and comments about what I've taught so far, put them in. Nina will relay them to me, and at the end of the session, I will take your questions and comments. The third Mishnah is now going to be about trapping, right? So we've been talking about weaving and sewing. Previous chapters were so much about carrying and transferring from one domain to another. Now we come to another one of the 39 prohibited labors of Shabbos, trapping, right? Trapping animals. So if a bird flies into a closet on Shabbos and you close the door of the closet so that that bird is trapped inside, or a deer wanders into your house and you close the door of the house so that the deer cannot get out of the house, you have trapped the bird, or you have trapped the deer inside, and this is a forbidden labor of Shabbos, a biblically forbidden labor, and you would be liable to bring the sin offering for it if you did it unwittingly, not knowing it was Shabbos or not knowing that this was prohibited. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel that was the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, that if a bird goes into a closet or a deer walks into a house and you close either the closet or the door of the house, you're liable. The rabbis add to this ruling of Rabbi Yehuda and say that if you trap a deer in a courtyard or in a garden or any kind of enclosure that the deer cannot leave, you would be liable for trapping, right? Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel explains not all enclosures are the same. If you trap a deer in such a large enclosure that you can't just, go inside the enclosure and grab the deer, if you would still have to catch the deer in that enclosure, so then you haven't trapped it, right? According to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, it counts as an enclosure if after it's caught inside, it now becomes relatively easy to take hold of the animal. So just the fact that, you corralled it in, something that's fenced in, that's acres wide, you haven't trapped it, you're not liable. It has to be a small enough enclosure that you could then go inside the enclosure and grasp the animal. Rabbah bar Rav Huna teaches, especially in the case of a free bird. When I read this, of course, being of an age, I remember the Lynyrd Skynyrd song. I don't know how many of our listeners here are familiar with Free Bird. What song is it you want to hear? Free Bird by Lynyrd Skynyrd from the 70s. But just like the lines of the song, I'm as free as a bird and I must be traveling on. A bird is built for freedom. There are, of course, domesticated birds, but some birds are so freedom-loving that they basically can't be domesticated. What bird is like that? Perhaps the most common bird of all, the sparrow. They live so proximate to humanity. Everyone, no matter where you live, has sparrows, some kind of sparrows nearby. Sparrows are never domesticated. If a sparrow flies into your house and you close the door, you have not trapped the sparrow. It is still free. It'll just circulate around the roof of your house until it can get out. To trap a sparrow, you would have to get it into a cage. The sages add, one who traps a blind or a sleeping deer on Shabbos, unwittingly, not knowing it's Shabbos, is liable. Let me just turn this off so it doesn't keep disturbing me. Sorry. A blind or a sleeping deer, one who traps a blind or a sleeping deer, chayiv, he's liable. But if you trap a lame or an old or a sick deer, you're not liable, right? Because that deer is not capable of running away. So in a sense, it was already trapped when you came upon it. You didn't really limit its freedom because that deer, you could have caught it at any time. You didn't take away its freedom because it's already, in some sense, at the end of its run. It's available to be caught easily. It's natural, strong, and fast, and and shy self. When you come near a deer, they run off. If the deer doesn't run off because it's sick, because it's lame, because it's old, and you somehow just closed the door on it, you're not liable because you essentially didn't trap it. It was already trapped. Mishnah number 4 here of chapter 13. A deer enters the house. This Mishnah is also about trapping, and this helps us understand principles that we've already learned. A deer enters the house. One locks the door, or one closes the door, right? A deer enters the house and somebody closes the door behind it. It's trapped in the house. We just learned that person is liable. Let's say 2 people close the door. Now, one person could have closed the door by himself. If 2 people close the door, they're exempt. Why? Because this is an atypical method of trapping the deer. Just as we learned that if somebody can carry something by himself and he carries it from the private domain to the public domain, he's liable for violating Shabbos, for carrying. But if 2 people carry this object that one of them could have easily carried by himself, this is considered an atypical manner of carrying. It's still prohibited rabbinically, but you wouldn't be liable to bring the sin offering. You would be exempt. Likewise, if 2 people combine to close the door, they're exempt from bringing the sin offering. But if it's a very heavy door or there's something wrong with the door is stuck, and it takes 2 people to close that door, 2 people are needed in order to close the door and trap the deer inside, then they would both be liable. The Gemara on this Mishnah adds, if you trap a lion on Shabbos, right? Again, all of these things are unwitting. You don't know it's Shabbos, or you didn't know this was prohibited, and that's how you become liable to bring the sin offering. If you did this intentionally, knowing it was Shabbos, it's a greater penalty, and it's in the hands of heaven. But it's Shabbos, and you trap a lion because it's so dangerous. The fact that, for example, you trapped it in your house, you closed the door on it, exempt. You haven't trapped the lion. That lion is still so dangerous that even though it might not be able to get out of the house after you close the door, it is not controlled. A lion is not considered trapped until it's in a cage and it's the danger has passed. And we're going to see a similar teaching in a moment about snakes. Mishnah number 5. One who partially covers a doorway. So this is going to be trapping the deer again. So a deer wanders into the house and somebody sits in the doorway. He'd like the deer to be caught. He'd like the deer to stay in the house. He's aware that he shouldn't close the door and trap it. So he's trying to sort of get around that, or maybe he just doesn't realize. So what does he do? He sits in the doorway. The deer is not trapped. A man is just sitting in the doorway of the house. The deer is inside. The deer could just shove past this person or leap over this person. The door, he's just sitting in the doorway. It's kind of like a partial obstacle, but the deer is not trapped. And he's just kind of hoping, maybe if I sit here, and then, at the end of Shabbos, the deer will still be there, and then I can really trap him when it's permitted. So he would be exempt. If another person comes and sits next to him, and now the 2 people in the doorway completely block the door, so now that the deer is trapped inside, the second person is liable. The first one didn't trap the deer. The door was still partially open. When the second one fills the doorway, he completes the trapping process, and only he is liable. The first one is not. On the other hand, if the doorway is more narrow and the first one sits in the doorway and that fully blocks the door, he's liable for trapping the deer inside. The second person comes and sits next to the first one, and then the first one leaves. The second one is still blocking the doorway, so the deer can't leave, but he's exempt because it was the first one who really changed the status of that deer from free to trapped. The second one was just like an extra measure of security who continues that security after the first one leaves, but he didn't trap the deer. He just came afterward, and so he is exempt. Likewise, somebody a deer wanders in before Shabbos and the door was closed. The guy didn't realize that a deer wandered into his house and the door was closed. So nobody trapped the deer on Shabbos. It became trapped before Shabbos. But he's thinking, okay, well, that's good. I want the deer not to get away. And just in case he starts like smashing the door or something or trying to get out, I'm going to lock the door. Maybe like do a deadbolt, which is going to add an extra measure of security to that door, make it harder for the deer to bang his way out. Is this person liable? No. The deer was already trapped because the door was closed. Adding the locking the door that's already closed, considered an extra measure of security. He is not liable, he's exempt. And not only is he exempt, but it's permitted. It is permitted. Usually when we say that somebody is exempt from bringing the sin offering, we're saying he's exempt, but it is rabbinically prohibited. Almost always. In fact, in all cases except 3. And this is one of them. That if the deer is inside, the door is closed, it's already locked, and all he did was add the measure of, the door is closed, and all he did is lock the door, which was already closed. He is exempt from bringing the sin offering, and this action is permitted, even rabbinically. And this is similar to one who traps a snake. There's a snake in the house. You're afraid it's a dangerous snake, or at least one that can harm you by biting, even if it's not venomous, but you're afraid that a person will get bit. So you manage to throw a bowl over it. You trap the snake. Now, if you trap the snake because you're a scientist and the venom of that snake is useful to you because you're going to make a medicine, you can make medicine out of certain snake venoms, and you trap the snake for that purpose, you're liable. But if you're just trapping the snake to prevent people in the house from being harmed by the snake, you are exempt. And not only are you exempt, but this is permitted rabbinically. These are the 2 or the 3 cases where exempt is not only exempt, but also permitted. The third case of all the cases, and it says here on this daf, that in all the world, every time that the sages say that something, that you're exempt from bringing the sin offering, all the other cases, but it would be rabbinically prohibited, but except for locking the door when a deer is trapped inside, or trapping a snake so that people don't get hurt. And that applies to trapping a scorpion or any animal that you're afraid might hurt people, and then you just trap it to stop it from people from being harmed. And the third case, I'm not going to go too much into it because there's more nuances, I believe, but it has to do with lancing a boil. That if you have a boil and you just want to drain some pus, like that's kind of inflicting a wound, but you're just relieving pain. And you're allowed to let the pus come out. And you're allowed to do that on Shabbos. You're exempt, and it's permitted. But there's nuances to that. So don't, because you heard me say this, next time it's Shabbos and you have a boil, stick a pin in to drain the pus. If you're really in that situation, look it up, because there's a little bit more halacha than this. Let's just say that in certain cases, if you're lancing a boil on Shabbos just to drain the pus to relieve some pain, as long as no blood comes out, you would be exempt, and it's permitted, but only in some cases. Okay, that is what I've got for us today, and that completes chapter 13. With God's help, we'll continue tomorrow with Daf Kuv Zion, page 107, and we'll be opening chapter 14 on Father's Day. And I wish all the fathers out there a very happy Father's Day, and all the moms and all the kids and all the parents and everybody who's in a family that has a father. Shkoyach to you, because a father wouldn't be a father if he didn't have a family who enables him to be a father. So, a blessing to every family out there. All right, let me look at your comments and questions. Christo Cheney says, then, as God permits me, I plan on continuing to learn from you, responding to what I said earlier, that we never say, I'm going to do this in the future, I'm going to do that. We always add, God willing, or im yirtzeh Hashem, God willing in Hebrew. Bill Eldridge, so, as regards being concerned when a member of the group dies, it seems as if it's a sort of extension of the idea of the family. I have plenty of friends who I would grieve for, as if they were kin, likewise classmates. Also, you seem to have left the candle unlit. Thank you, Bill. That's when Nina ran in here. So I appreciate that. But yeah, I think that this idea, it's so important, and that's why the sages did not define. They just said, if a member of a group dies, everyone in the group should be concerned. How big a group? How do we define group? They left it undefined, and I think they're encouraging us to cultivate within ourselves the feeling that we are a member of many different groups, and that if in any of those groups a person dies, we need to take it personally and feel the loss that the soul is the candle of God. So when a soul leaves this world, it's like a candle is extinguished, and when that light goes out, we need to feel it and grieve it, let it go through us, and if we can summon tears, we should. Bill Eldridge says, is it also forbidden if you close the door but haven't yet spotted the bird? That is, if you don't realize the animal is trapped. Okay, if you trapped a deer and it's unwitting because you didn't know it was Shabbos, or you didn't know that it was prohibited to trap on Shabbos, that is unwitting. If you closed the door, you just didn't know there was a bird in the house, I'm not sure that is unwitting. That's different. That's a circumstance beyond your control. You had no idea the bird was there. I don't think that's the same, and I think there you would be exempt from the sin offering, but I'd have to look it up to be sure. But it seems to me, from the learning we've done here in Tractate Shabbos, that if you didn't even know that was happening, that's different. Bill Eldridge, pardon, type too fast. Is it also unwitting if you haven't seen the animal? Exactly. I don't think it's unwitting. Kelsa Canedo, late question about writing. Is connect the dot drawing appropriate for Shabbos? No, it's not. You just cannot pick up something that makes a mark, a pen, a pencil, a paintbrush, anything, and make a mark. We saw that when we looked into Shulchan Aruch, that in terms, you might be exempt from bringing the sin offering. You might not have violated the Torah prohibition on writing, which requires creating 2 characters, 2 letters that have a meaning, or 2 marks that have a meaning. But rabbinically, it is definitely prohibited to write anything at all. So we don't connect the dots, we don't make a mark, we don't make a scribble, we don't make a doodle. You just can't even pick up a pen or a quill or anything because it's muktzah. It has no valid purpose on Shabbos. The only reason you would be permitted to pick up a pen or a writing instrument on Shabbos is because you needed the place where it is. Like if it's on your dinner table and you just want to move it so that you can put a plate there and eat, then you could do that. And there might be some non-writing use for which a pen or a quill is useful, and that if you had that in mind, it might be okay to use it for that on Shabbos. But there's no writing of any kind, no drawing of any kind that's going to be permitted on Shabbos. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. I'm wishing you a good vach, a good week. In fact, I'm wishing you a great week and a great Father's Day. May you learn and teach and share and show compassion and have all of God's blessings in your life, particularly health, meaning, joy, and prosperity. All the best.